הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבשחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבשחים גם יוחד.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. I'm so thrilled today to have Rabbi Shai Held with me in the studio. He is a philosopher, theologian, and Bible scholar and serves as the president and dean at the Hadar Institute. He received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America and by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. He is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, and his newest book, Judaism is About Love, which I have here. And he is the host of Hadar's newest podcast, Answers Withheld. I'll say that my first encounter with you was, if you remember, I don't know if you do remember, was at the Wexner Graduate Fellowship. You were a teacher there, and I heard that you were a student of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who I think, if our audience doesn't know by now, is a hero of mine, then they've not been watching. So I seeked you out, and I had the opportunity to learn with you for the first time, and then continued to follow you since then. And I'll say that in addition, your book, The Heart of Torah, which I know is not the book that you are sharing with the world right now, but has played a major role in my learning. I think every year, I assume I'm not the only person who does this. You pick your Parsha book for the year. What are you going to make sure you learn every week? If you're lucky, you do 2 or 3. And I think since your book came out, 3 years I've gone through your book. There's 2 essays per Parsha, so I don't always get to both. And I think one year I did an A year, and the next year I did a B year. But I love it. I've bought it for other people before, and it's an amazing, I think, fresh and deep and thoughtful way to look at the Parsha. So yes, everyone on the planet is talking about this book right now. It's everywhere. I mentioned to Rav Shai before that this is not my copy. I had to borrow it from my colleague Carol here because my bubby was with me over Shabbos. Hi, Bubby Hilda. And saw my copy and started reading it, and I couldn't ask her to give it back to me, so I didn't bring it in today. So this is the book of the hour, but certainly I don't want to overlook your previous books or the podcast. And with that, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So 4 months ago, I think Abby was interviewing you for In the Spotlight, and I saw you in the hallway, and I said, I want to have you on. I want to talk about something in the Jewish calendar. And you said, let's do Teshuva. I don't know if you remember that, but I remember that for sure.
I remember saying it, but now I can't remember why I said
exactly.
it. But great.
Oh, great. Well, that was my next question, which is, first of all, define that word for us, but what is Teshuva, and what draws you? Why are you interested in the topic of Teshuva and talking about it?
Yeah, thank you. So Teshuva literally is probably best translated as return. We usually use the word repentance.
Right.
What interests me about the idea of Teshuva is the idea of taking responsibility for who we are in the world and how we are in the world. It's sort of about becoming, at least in part, the authors of our own lives. Like, who do we want to be? Who do I want to go through the world being? Life, it feels to me at least, happens so fast, and routine and routinization is so powerful that the idea of sort of stopping and asking who I am and who do I aspire to be, what kind of human being do I want to be, to sound new agey for a minute, what do I want to manifest in the world, right? I feel like that's just a really important spiritual, religious, ethical project. Just a reminder of the centrality of that as to what it means to be a person.
Beautiful. And I think, we often think, I think Judaism brings us back to different questions, different times of the year, but certainly kind of Teshuva season begins with the new month of Elul, Rosh Chodesh Elul, and goes through the Yamim Noraim, the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. There's kind of this time where we're meant to do this work. First of all, just any reflections on that? Is like, why is it a reflection of what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are about, that we should do Teshuva, or is it that we can't do this all year round, so we need a time for it? Why is Elul and the holidays, that's the time to do it?
Right, so let me actually, if I could, start by turning your question upside down, which is that it's really interesting that Maimonides, Rambam, whose laws of repentance, Hilchot Teshuva, are, you would say, kind of the classical Jewish text on Teshuva, he makes a very conscious choice not to put Hilchot Teshuva with the laws that are connected to the calendar. He places them in Sefer Hamadah, in the book of knowledge, I guess you would translate that, which is really where he lays out the foundations of what it means to be a Jew. And I think that's because for him, Teshuva as a project of kind of taking responsibility for who I am can't possibly be limited to 3 days a year, or even 10 days a year, or even 40. Teshuva is a way of being in the world, right? Now, of course, we all need reminders and we all need wake-up times, and that's part of what this month of Elul that we're in and the holidays that follow are about. But I think, I used to say when I was a Hillel rabbi and I was kind of giving regular sermons, I would always tell students that paradoxically one of the things they could do on Rosh Hashanah that would be most powerful is decide that Rosh Hashanah was going to be less central in their life. By which I meant, don't concentrate your project of being a Jew in 2 days a year. Don't concentrate tshuva as, this is a time of year when I reflect who I am. But rather something more like, this is a time of the year when I commit to constantly reflecting on who I am. Right? Something more like that. Now, of course, since these days are associated with God taking stock of the world, it sort of makes sense theologically that this would be the time that we kind of participate with God in this project of examining ourselves.
Beautiful. And so then tell a little bit around, so I hear you saying it's a time to examine ourselves and almost decide who we're going to be or who we're going to manifest. I love that language. I'm starting to be a believer in manifestations. I like it. I
didn't even know where that came from. That felt like the right formulation.
You manifested it.
Exactly.
Well, there's been a lot, the Olympic season, the famous Paris Olympics are behind us, and there was a lot of talk of athletes saying they manifested themselves winning the gold. That it's not just about going to the gym, it's also about having an image of where you're going. And obviously sports are in some ways the easiest ways to judge whether you've had success. Teshuva might be a little bit more complicated. So let's zoom out with me for a little bit and just kind of share around, you mentioned maybe it's return and it's not repentance. What are kind of some of the big different ways of thinking about how we approach Teshuva? You can start with the Rambam if you want. What's your understanding of what he's going for there?
Yeah, for the Rambam, Teshuva is kind of an ocean of a topic. I think that my inclination would be to focus on one particular thing that he says that I've always found really kind of honestly somewhere between daunting and inspiring. He says in the 7th chapter of his discussion of the laws of tshuva that it's very important that we not think of tshuva as just about taking responsibility for the things we've done or not done, but rather for the character traits that we have. It's not just about deeds, it's about my personality. Am I a compassionate person? It's not just, did I go to the Shiva? Which it's also about that for sure, but it's also about, am I a compassionate, caring person? And that notion that it's not just about conduct, but it's also about character, I mean, really it's essential to his whole view of Judaism and the religious life more generally, which is that it is very significantly focused on cultivating our character. But I also think I think the thing that I find both inspiring and daunting about it is it pushes us to look deeper. Like, it's one thing to say, I regret that I did that. It's another thing to ask, what is it inside me that made me do that? So it's an invitation to a much deeper kind of work. And ultimately, I think probably genuine change often, maybe always, requires deeper kind of work. Just to decide, I've always been mean to the people I work with. I'm not going to do that anymore. That's not usually so effective, as opposed to asking, what is it within me that makes me act in this way? What character traits do I have? Or to use language that Maimonides, as a medieval sage, would not recognize, what wounds do I carry that manifest themselves, here we go with manifesting again, in this kind of behavior? So that notion that we're supposed to go deeper than just our actions and actually ask what personality traits we have, I find that to be just like very daunting and challenging. I think daunting in a good way most of the time. Daunting in the sense that it's hard work. Most of us don't love looking in the mirror and seeing the less than beautiful stuff. But I think that Maimonides challenges us to do just that.
Beautiful. So I know I hear you saying it daunting, but I'm trying to imagine someone who wants to put that into practice, right? So it's one thing for you to, this time of year, make your list of wrongs or, write out for yourself what you imagine you could be. How does one even start the process of trying to look inward and change their character?
Yeah, I think that's in some ways the $1 million question about tshuva and virtue, or tshuva and character. I mean, for starters, I think it's simply about probing one step deeper. It's about looking at the ways I behave in the world and asking myself in an honest way, why do I do this? Like, why do I behave in this way? Okay, so, I don't know, take, an example that I'm sure some people struggle with. Yelling at my kids, being on a short fuse with my children, something like that. What's happening for me? Why do I do that? that's really the first step. And by the way, immediately we can say, this is why something like therapy can be, I'm not saying is, but can be part of the process of tshuva, right? Coming to understand myself better is a way of potentially empowering myself to take responsibility for who I am and how I manifest in the world.
Great, so I'm happy you brought up therapy, because my first thought when you shared that a little bit was, like, then why not just do therapy? Why not just go, work with a therapist, figure out what's going on, and then try to work through those issues? You're a theologian. We were talking about this in the context of,
Right.
the month of Elul and the high holidays. How does this process, enter the world of theology? Why do we have to do teshuva, I guess, from a religious perspective, not
Right.
a human perspective?
So I think that, I actually think this is a harder question than it might at first seem. I mean, I think sometimes when you read, say, some of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, one of the great 20th century thinkers about repentance, who we can talk about, one of the things you sometimes feel is, there is a kind of gesturing towards, a move towards a kind of therapeutic language at times, right? So how is it different from therapy? For me, at least, part of what makes tshuva unique is that it stems from a sense of being accountable. It's not just, I'd like to be different than I am. It's that I am accountable to someone for the kind of life that I live. That's what makes it very theological. It's not that I'm just asking myself. That's noble and important, right? It's not just that I'm asking myself, though, how do I become kinder? It's that I feel myself challenged by God. Are you a person who lives a life of chesed, oriented around love and kindness, or are you not? It's the accountability, almost with a capital A, that makes tshuva kind of almost irreducibly theological, at least for me.
Wow, great. So I hear you saying a little bit around, there's what's called lishma, for its own sake. You could be I want to be better for my own sake, but there's a different framework which is about being in relationship. And it could be a relationship with humans, it could be a relationship with the Jewish people, it could be a relationship with God. Certainly this time of year, theologically, there's about that relationship with God, and you're putting in there the word accountability. Or maybe we would call it, Rav Yetz, if he was here, would say brit, that there's some kind of relationship with God, and we have an accountability that comes with that. So play out Rabbi Soloveitchik a little bit more, because I know that I've heard you teach on him a little bit before. How does he think through some of these questions, and what are your reactions to that?
Yeah, so I think that, speaking personally, I will say that when I was younger, I found some of Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings on teshuva to be unbelievably inspiring. And now that I'm older, I find them unbelievably inspiring, and I'm also not certain I buy into them completely. So maybe I can try to flesh out a minute about what that's about. So one of Rabbi Soloveitchik's great insights about tshuva, which I think he would argue is based on Maimonides, and in some ways I think it is, it's a very modernist reading of Maimonides, is the idea that what it means to be in relationship with God, for Rabbi Soloveitchik more generally, is like God to become a creator of worlds. And what that culminates in, manifests ultimately in, is that I not only create worlds, things around me, but I ultimately am responsible for shaping and sculpting a self, right? I am the creator of myself. At one point he goes so far as to say, kind of pretty hyperbolically obviously, that the idea that I am the creator of myself is the great idea that Judaism has introduced into the world. I mean, that's almost by definition hyperbolic. There's not one great idea, but obviously that tells you something about how important he found that idea, that on some level God creates me and then I create myself in a kind of second act of recreation. He takes that very far. He will say, for example, in Halachic Man, that the phrase, which I remember by heart because I've taught it so many times, there is a severing of one's psychic identity with one's previous I. A severing of one's psychic identity. I remember the first time I read that, I was like, that is really moving, but also kind of terrifying and disturbing, because it sounds like a kind of break, almost like a mental break. What do you mean, a severing of one's psychic identity? That's very strong. Sure. Now, I think obviously what he's trying to do is to be incredibly motivating. You can and must become something other than you are. You are not permitted to just say, well, that's just the way I am.
Right.
The ultimate kind of spiritual cop-out.
Right.
That's just the way I am. What do you want from me?
Yeah.
Right? You can't say that. Where I've come to feel more hesitant about this is actually in the process of writing the Heart of Torah, where I came to see how sober the Torah is about the possibility of human change and transformation. That the Torah at one and the same time says you are obligated to work on yourselves to try to become better, and you should know it's really hard, and there are certain things about yourself that you may need to throw yourself upon God's mercy. If you were to divide Jewish thinkers into those who think that tshuva is about what I do for myself versus tshuva is about what God helps me do, Rabbi Soloveitchik is very much in the former camp. We'll call that, just to be provocative, the liberal camp.
Okay.
Right? The kind of like, human beings, we can do it.
Right.
I just, I think about how on Yamim Noraim, on the days of awe, we say, Avinu Malkeinu Chonenu Vanenu, right? Our Father, our Parent, our King, show us grace and answer us, Ki ein banu maasim, because we can't do it. We don't have the deeds. And I think what I find hard about some of these formulations in Rabbi Soloveitchik is they don't make enough space for just saying, I need help. I don't feel, I've been trying to change this part of myself for 30. I can't seem to make any headway at all. Please, God, help me. Now, I have a feeling, to be fair, that if I said that to Rabbi Soloveitchik, he'd say, yeah, of course, that also. But I don't think he always voices that. There's this very kind of modernist way of writing that's about, there's no limit to what you can do to change yourself. I just feel like, as I've gotten older, tried to change myself, tried to write about what I think is going on in the Torah. I mean, let me actually give, maybe your viewers will kind of find this helpful, like a very simple biblical example. Deuteronomy expresses this tension very powerfully in a very simple way. The 10th chapter of Deuteronomy commands the Israelites, you must circumcise your own hearts. Cut away the thickening around your heart. 20 chapters later, Deuteronomy imagines God saying to the people, okay, I'll do it. I'll circumcise your hearts. And commentators have always struggled with, what's the relationship between those two statements? Yeah. You do it, okay, I'll do it.
Right.
And I don't think it's about choosing one. It's about some kind of dialectic back and forth between I can change and decide who I am, and I might need help from God. Again, I don't think Soloveitchik would really find that alien. Just don't think he always gives, to my mind at least, enough voice to that second experience.
Right. There's two pieces here. That there's the doing your part and also needing the help. That resonates for me.
Exactly right. That's a great formulation.
And that's true for everything, right? I think we're post-October 7th world, we're saying we need to do our part and we need God's help. Everything that we're trying to do is some combination of those. And I think that Teshuva obviously is a very personal way of thinking about it. I want to jump on one thing there that you brought up, which is really interesting because I think one of the knocks on the world today is there's a very I-focused generation. We're very focused on I. And when you use Rab Soloveitchik's language, you can almost apply it to the I generation. I have to recreate myself, and it's all about the creation. And I'll say, in the heart of Torah, one of the most beautiful passages that I sit with all the time, I think you start by quoting Bernie Steinberg from Harvard, is that right? Who I also had when I was at Harvard for law school, talking about the difference between, we're talking about the days of awe, the difference between awe and fear. And that the difference between awe and fear is when you have fear, but when you remove the I part, it becomes awe. And I think after that you say the difference between thank you and praise is thank you for something. Praising is just without the I again in our relationship with God. And we think about kind of, you can imagine a world of Teshuva where everyone's afraid of punishment. But you could also imagine a world of Teshuva where it's just about God and not about the self. So how do in the modern world where it's very focused on I need to do millions of hours of therapy and I can't be focused on everyone else who's out there. And let me lean into fixing myself. And I might be busy for 100 years, I'll talk to you when I get back. How do we manage that, the I part alongside the we part and alongside there's a God that's nothing to do with just me part?
Yeah, this is really hard. It feels to me like a series of really interesting questions.
Sorry,
first of all, no, not at all. On the contrary, I love that. And thank you for remembering Bernie Steinberg, who, as you probably know, died in the last year. And I think about him all the time. So I appreciate your mentioning him. I think that there's a paradox at the heart of thinking about character. You find philosophers who think about virtue, whether they're Jewish or not, talk about this kind of question a lot, which is, wait a minute, if part of what it means to be virtuous is to be less self-centered, then thinking about virtue is a problem, isn't it? Because it makes me think about myself all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about myself so that I become less self-centered. That's a kind of a very hard knot to untie. It's actually quite complicated. I mean, this relates to your interest in Musar as well.
100%.
I think that part of the challenge here, and it doesn't feel to me like a solution really, or it's not an answer, it's a direction, is to ask, what kind of I am I supposed to be in the business of creating, right? Am I creating my own self for its own sake, or am I creating myself in significant part so that I can be accountable and responsive? Am I trying to create myself to become the kind of person who's more focused on someone else's needs? But there is a paradox there, and I think it is very hard, very, very hard to escape. I find, for whatever it's worth, that part of the work of creating oneself is actually very actively bringing one's attention to other people, right? It's not only about a turn inward to look at myself, it's a turn outward. Look at that person that I have never paid attention to before, who's lonely, who no one says hi to, right? It's really about kind of, part of what it means to create myself, I think, is to think about where I'm directing my attention. And if it only becomes more self-enclosed, then I'm doing something wrong. But I think this goes to something very, very deep. You know, all spiritual practices, if you want to speak in more traditional language, all mitzvah observances can ultimately be made about me. You know, meditation can be about forgetting the self, and meditation can be about, you know, gazing on my own navel. Davening can be about being, prayer, right, can be focused on God and my relationship with God, or it can be about, I'm like really looking for a powerful experience. There's always the possibility of reducing spiritual practices to just kind of deepening of selfishness or self-centeredness. And then there's the possibility of really like pushing myself outward, pushing myself beyond myself, which is, we should be clear, really hard work. Right? If you have viewers who are sitting, wait a minute, thinking this is really hard, and the answer is yes, it is really hard. It's hard for all of us, I think. Anyone who's honest about this, I think, would admit like there are times where it's really hard because you kind of can almost co-opt the process of tshuva into being, more about me, more about me, more about me, as opposed to how can I be a me who's focused outward.
Right? It almost, for me, then adds like a third category, because we have like the one category is like, I want to focus on my actions, right? We have like a whole school of thought, 10,000 hours, what are your habits? If you do this thing 5 minutes a day, there's some cultivating the direction of your life. And then we have a second category, which is something about character, which is like, okay, can I be more patient, more compassionate, right? That kind of thing, where it's about like, I'm working on a character trait in me, and it affects how I look at the world. And there's a third that is almost like, can I change the lens through which I'm seeing the world? Right, which is like some sort of, it's about me, it's not about me, it's about my family, it's about the Jewish people, it's about God, but some element of like how I look at the world flows through all of my actions, and that's some sense of teshuva. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I really love that. I'm very drawn to that. I mean, in my new book, I actually talk about this briefly, and I wish in some ways I talked about it more, kind of as I began to as I reached the conclusion of writing this book, I realized that that love as a way of seeing was like a really powerful idea that I had not given enough attention to in my own life and my own thinking. Like, what does it mean to see the world, to use traditional language, with ayin tovah, with a generous eye? To see myself that way, to see other people that way, maybe even to think about what it would mean to see God that way. That became really, really important to me, the kind of the spiritual project of seeing. When I see another person in front of me, do I first see a catalog of faults? Or do I see a human being trying to make their way in the world who probably has done some beautiful things and had some incredible moments of kindness, right? Like that's like avoda, I feel like. That's like spiritual practice in some very deep way. And that's also really hard. It's really about changing your eyes.
Right. But I have Rav Yitz joining us in the conversation and saying, you see someone created in God's image when you see them, right? That can you walk around the world and say, in his language, this person is infinitely valuable, equal to every other person, and unique, and no one in history would be like them, right? That's a big Torah of his.
Yeah.
And that's on one hand theology, on the other hand practice, right? It's this idea of like, can you, when you see that person, like you said, can you see them in an empathetic way, or can you see them in a theological way that brings you towards them in some way?
So, one of my favorite passages in the Torah, it kind of takes my breath away every time I think about it, which is sort of crazy because I think about it a lot. But there's this incredible moment in Breshit, in Genesis, when Hagar, who is unseen by her masters, Abraham and Sarah, right? They never refer to her by name. They only refer to her as your handmaiden, right? Shivchatech, right? Your handmaiden. And then she runs away. She runs into an angel, and the first thing the angel says is Hagar. His first word is to name her, right? And then at the end of the scene, she says to God, Ata el roi, you are the God who sees me. And I literally sometimes makes me cry to read that scene. Wow. It's so moving. Like, it basically says we worship a God who sees those whom no one else notices. And then comes the kind of practice of, okay, what would it mean to worship that God? Does that mean that I'm supposed to see in a way that's different because I'm worshiping a God who sees? That's like, I feel like that is really deep work.
Yeah.
Really deep work, like Ata El Roi. That's incredible. By the way, she's the only character in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, as far as I know, who gives God a name. She's the only one, right?
Wow.
You are the God who sees me. She's a slave, not an Israelite. She's actually mistreated by Israelites. Yeah. It's the chutzpah of Breshit, right? Yeah. The sheer audacity, right? She's an Egyptian slave woman oppressed by Israelite masters, right? The book of Exodus flipped on its head in anticipation.
Yeah.
She says, you're the God who sees me.
Wow. Beautiful. So I want to ask like not a technical question, but maybe it's a personal question, which is, how do you go? You're a theologian, you're a philosopher, you're thinking about these big ideas. How do you bring those into your? How do you suggest people bring those into their lives? I'll say, like, for me, when I hear a story like that, it hits me, right, and I can carry that. Hopefully for a few hours today, right? Hopefully when I go take my train home, I'll have a moment of seeing someone other than myself instead of looking at my phone while I'm rushing to catch a train, hopefully, God willing. Right. But it is the hope that there are aha moments from theology or from a book like this that like hit someone in the kishkas and that brings them on a path, let's call it path of return, or is it about like, okay, I need a strategy, the Musar world would say, you need a practice, you need like some strategy for how you're going to get there. How do you think through those questions?
Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook says something that I think is interesting, that is part of how I think about moments like this, about questions like this, really. He says that sometimes tshuva happens in a process, and sometimes the tshuva happens in a moment. I think there are times when we read something or we hear something that lands so deeply with us that something about our heart is altered. I remember the first time I heard Rav Yitz teach, I was like, wow, I'm not sure I'm ever going to be the same Jew again, right? Like, it wasn't, I don't remember what he said.
Right.
I just was like, oh, I want a part of what that is, right? The one time I've ever been in the room with Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist meditation teacher, I remember going home to my wife and saying, oh my God, whatever that guy is, like, I want to be like a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of that guy's compassion. So I think there are moments when it does that. I think learning can be like that. But most of the time, it's much more, pedestrian, quotidian, day-to-day than that. It's like, oh, okay, so how am I going to carry myself differently on the subway? I just learned something about God seeing those who aren't seen. What does it mean to get on the subway in New York City? Well, here's a deeply theological question. What does it mean to live in a city where images of God who are infinitely valuable, to use your invocation of Rav Yitz, sleep in their own urine? Very concretely, what does that say to me? What claim does it make on me? What challenge does it lay before me? Now, I don't pretend for a minute to have great answers to any of this. Right. But I do think it's kind of like an alternation between, whoa, there's a moment that really shapes who I am, and I really got to work on this. I mean, I'll give you a very, maybe too personal example. Something that I have been sort of consciously working on in the last couple of years is when I feel that someone is speaking to me in a way that is disrespectful or hurtful, and I have the impulse to respond in a way that is like, why are you doing that? Or much worse, to just sort of be like, okay, first of all, what's probably going on right now is happening inside of them. It is not about me. I don't need to make it about me. And also, I don't have the right, the sages have this image that glorified are those who can be insulted without feeling the need to insult in return.
I was just
also really important in Musar, right? So I've been really sort of working on that. Like, okay, I feel the need to lash out right now. I'm going to take a deep breath instead. I'm not always great at it, but that is very day to day. It's like I'm sitting in a meeting. I really don't like how you said that. Oh, by the way, and I should have said it more clearly. Either it's about something going on in you, or I'm misreading you because there's something going on in me, and then you doubly don't deserve to be the recipient of what I might respond and say. That's been like really hard work for me. I mean, I think we all have, to use kind of contemporary language, triggers, like things that we're particularly sensitive to. Oh, the way you say that reminds me of how my mother spoke to me.
Right.
The way you say that reminds me of, my first marriage and whatever it might, right? And okay, I have the capacity to breathe. By the way, I think that's a big piece of tshuva too, which is restoring in ourselves an awareness that not every stimulus has to elicit an immediate response from me. Okay, that's a stimulus. I can now take a breath and have freedom. I can decide how to respond to you. That's something that in the world of Musar, Shlomo Volbe talks about really beautifully and powerfully, right? He says, very few of us exercise free will ever, right? So the capacity to feel pressed upon and then say, I'm not going to really do that right now. That's not who I want to be in the world or how I want to be in the world. That's a very, I think, simple, incredibly difficult, and yet simple piece of day-to-day strategy. Notice when I feel stimulated in that way. And if stimulated is not the right word for folks, probably all of our own words, triggered, pressed, my buttons are being pushed, whatever it might be. Until no, I can really pause.
Right. Choosing to respond instead of reacting.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. And I'll just sit with that for a second. First of all, I think, for people who haven't tried that, it's an amazing and liberating thing to even do once. To be like, okay, the next time someone says something that I normally would react to just see what it feels like to not react and just let something sit with you and absorb it. It's very, it's something that I've tried also struggled with a bit, but I think it fills you up in some ways. That you think it's going to make you feel terrible because you didn't shoot back, let's say, and it can be very filling. It really can be like you tell me you've been trying it. Like there's some element of
yeah. I think you discover in some sense your own humanity in that project because you're not. The experience of something not automatically eliciting a reaction is very freeing.
Yeah.
There's something really beautiful. It's like, oh, I'm here.
Right.
As opposed to just kind of, I had this experience a couple weeks ago. One of my colleagues sent me an email which felt to me like they were kind of dismissing an idea I had worked on for a really long time. And I had this part of me that was like, you can't do that to me. And then I had this moment, I was like, okay. That is never a good way to respond, right? And I just sort of sat with it for years, and I realized that actually my reaction had nothing to do with what she had written to me. It had to do with stuff I was struggling with in my own life at home. And it was so tempting to just sort of, quote unquote, make myself feel better by making her feel bad, which only would have made me feel worse also, right? Everybody loses.
Right.
Everybody loses.
Yeah.
Right? And so, taking enough time to actually realize what might be going on, and to think about, how do I want to respond?
Yeah, you're bringing up for me. I was once in a setting. I'll try to protect this space where someone was in the same room as me and sent me a very hurtful email, let's say, and I needed to respond. And I think they knew I'm in the room at my computer, so obviously I'm going to see the email. And I struggled a lot. I think what I ended up landing on was kind of like, I'm going to acknowledge that I received this email, but I'm not ready to respond to it yet, which felt like, it almost is like, you almost feel like in one of those like superhero movies where like, you know, someone's like shooting lasers at you and they like, you have a shield around you a little bit because there's like an element of like, okay, like instead of just shooting back, there's like, okay, let's breathe here. You're adding a beautiful piece, which I didn't do, which is I should do some reflection and not just clarify how to respond in a way that's not painful to them, but also know what's going on for me here. It's very liberating. And I think this goes to both questions we've discussed already, which is one is around, you know, what is the process of getting to that, right? Is there like an aha moment in your life where you realize, okay, I've been doing too many of these quick responses and they make me feel terrible, or there's the, you know, I just read the passage you mentioned in the Talmud and I really need to try to see what it's like to have whatever language you use, like the shining of the heavens on me. And then there's the work of, okay, I need to be ready the next time this happens in my life. And when that happens, do I have this in my back pocket that I know I'm going to do that? So, you know, I don't know if this is too in the weeds, but just share out, is it like the type of thing where you're like, it's top of mind for you now, where you're like, okay, I'm looking out for that, and when it happens, I'm not going to respond in the moment?
You know, it's interesting, Justin, because one of the things I think you didn't mention is another way one can learn this is by blowing it really badly. Right? I mean, I think some of us learn it because like, oh, did I really just say that?
Yeah.
That is not what I want to manifest in the world, right? That is not, you know, and so there's a lot of different ways to come to this project, I think. I think for me, I mean, I don't know if I'm being, you know, too revealing. I will say,
no, I think you're you. That's what you want to learn from.
One of the hardest things I've ever experienced professionally was what they call a 360 review, you know, where people around you in your work review your work. And everyone said all these really lovely things about my teaching and my caring about staff. I was like, oh, look at me, I'm so great, right? And then like 3 different people had said, but sometimes I feel like he can get irritable too quickly. And I was like, I remember I said to Rachel, to my wife, I was just like, really? She was like, hello? You know? And I was like, oh, wow. That's not actually how I want to. First of all, half the time it's not even conscious. I'm not like trying to lash out. I'm just like being quick, you know? And actually, no, like slow down, you know? And I think so for me, it was like a very powerful learning experience of, oh, other people are noticing this. And they're saying, which is very generous of them in a funny way, it's discordant with who I know he is, right? I get confused when I feel like this person who's very kind most of the time is then impatient with me.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, so then if you really, I mean, which I have to say, I wasn't so eager to go on this journey.
What do you do with
asking
that?
myself, wait, why is this? Why am I doing that? Like, what is happening that I'm not even conscious that I'm doing it, right? And so it's a combination of, I think, A, being present in the moment and noticing, oh, I feel like reacting, I'm not going to react, what you call this sort of shielding piece. But then also it's one step deeper. Why am I reacting that way? Like, what buttons is this pressing for me? And I honestly, I feel like in the last couple of years, I've had to do some really deep work about trying to understand, like, yeah, why do certain situations trigger me in certain ways? And trying to get more bechira, as Rav Wolbe would say, right? Trying to restore a sense of my own freedom. I don't need to do that.
Right. Slow the game down so you can
slow the game down,
make
exactly.
some choices.
And by the way, it's worth saying, I think one of the things, because, you know, it's interesting to me, the example you gave was email. The expectation that we respond right away is toxic, not just because it's unreasonable and it drives us crazy, but also it makes us reactive, right? I've really learned, it took me a while, that like sometimes when like a student sends me an email, even if I like know exactly what I want to say back, it's like I'm not going to respond until tomorrow. Because I want to make sure that it's a considered response in a way that email doesn't always make possible, right? Like slow down the velocity of your, you know, electronic exchanges. Right. That's not always so easy either.
No. And a lot of people in the productivity world go the opposite way. You shouldn't read an email twice because you're wasting time. Like, deal with it when it's in front of you and move on.
Although you should read an email twice because reading it only once can hurt people.
Of course, we're in conversation between our business brain and our Teshuva brain.
Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay. You know, we've talked, and I don't know if you feel like you've gotten at this already, but I want to just hear it crystallized. So we've talked a little bit about how you've been in conversation with what Rambam says and what Rav Soloveitchik says and what Rav Kook says. If someone comes to you and is like, Rav Shai, it's the beginning of Elul, like, what do I need to know? And let's expand our audience. It's not a student at Hadar who's been deep in this, but it's someone who's, maybe they don't even know the month of Elul as which is the month before Tishrei, where the high holidays are. There's a month in front of them. What do you tell them? What's the framework you give them, and what's their homework?
I think I'll be honest and say one thing I find hard about this question is that I feel like I have to ask or gauge to what extent theologically framed language is either congenial or totally alienating, right? Because there's some people for whom I might say something like, this is a chance to ask, what are the ways in which I can restore and deepen my relationship with God? And there's some people I would never say that to because it sounds like Martian, right? I mean, I feel like my real answer, which I don't mean to be coy, is my answer to almost every question like this, which is to begin by asking that person a whole bunch of questions about who they are and what's bringing them to that. Because there's no stock answer to this. It's like I said, to you earlier, for me, it's a certain kind of sense of accountability to God. And there are other people for whom that just sounds like, I don't really know what you're saying. So I think I might ask someone, do you have a sense in your life of ways that you feel stuck in shortcomings or failures or things that you've been reaching for as a person that you just can't access? And let's frame it in a way that is congenial to you. I mean, I will say this relates to something I've been asked a bunch about this new book. I've been asked it before, but it's kind of really come up a lot around this book, which is I've had a few people who have read this book who identify deeply as Jews in purely secular terms, who have said to me, do you have advice for me about how I should make sense of all the ways that you talk about God in this book? And one of the things that I've said, especially to a couple of people I'm close to and I feel like I can sort of say this to without risking it being hurtful, is it's a little confusing to me whether I'm the right person or precisely the wrong person for you to be discussing this with. On the one level, of course I'm the right person. It's my book. It's like the ideas that came from my heart and my learning, right? And I'm happy to talk to you about that. On another level, I might be exactly the wrong person because it really does feel kind of almost irreducibly theological to me. It really is about God. And I feel sort of torn about that, because I'm always tempted to turn the question around, which is, well, you tell me. And I've had people say things that I found sort of funny and interesting. I mean, one very old, very close friend of mine says, yeah, just tune out for certain sections. Or, I had another old friend say to me, yeah, I just think for me of God as your way of talking about the values that you think matter most. And I said to him, as long as you're clear that that's not what I mean when I say God, fine.
Right.
What works for you works for you. So I feel a similar question about tshuva when some generic person says, what is Elul about?
Yeah.
I find that a very hard question to answer. I hope I'm not copping out.
No, that's fine.
And it actually feels to me like that is a very Mussarish answer in a way, by which I mean your job in that moment is to figure out who is the human being asking you the question, and what is their, what are they bringing to the table?
Right. Okay. So speaking of the book, talk to me a little bit around, I know it's an amazing book and there are a lot of themes there, but through the lens of this question of Teshuvah, what are some of the themes that come up in the book that can help us think about Teshuvah in a meaningful way?
So let me mention a couple, and then we can see where the conversation goes from there. One is, in one of the chapters of this book, I play around with this idea that I title the gifts of God flow through you. And the idea of that is that there's a kind of temptation we have sometimes to hoard or grasp blessings that come our way. And that, according to a whole variety of Jewish spiritual texts, the idea is really to sort of enjoy the brachot, the blessings that God gives us, but to keep the flow going. Maharal of Prague, a great 16th century sage, talks about not becoming a dam. There's divine love and grace that flows through the world, and we can't dam up the flow. I love that image. I think it's very moving. And I've often thought that a really kind of provocative and challenging way of thinking about teshuva is to ask ourselves, what is it in me that causes me to be a dam? What are the ways in which good things come and I'm like, mine, I want it. It feels to me like this kind of vision of a spiritual life is very countercultural to a consumerist culture. It's not about having things. It's not ascetic in the sense of I can't have anything, but it's really about an orientation towards generosity. I realize how much I've been given and I want to keep kind of pushing it forward. And I find the image that Maharal offers very beautiful, and the challenge that it lays before us of, this seems like it would be just natural and organic. So why isn't it so much of the time? Right? Rav Yitzchak Hutner, a great 20th century rabbinic sage, he talks about how when someone does an act of kindness for you, it can't but blossom into further kindness in the world when it is allowed to proceed healthily. Well, that's a very provocative formulation. What makes it not proceed healthily?
Yeah.
Right? That's such an interesting question. Like, why does someone do something kind for me and I'm like, no, mine?
Yeah.
As opposed to, oh, yours too. I want to do for others what they did for me. So that's one place where I think about teshuva a lot. And it goes back to some of the things we've been talking about earlier about what are the wounds that we carry, the things that make us so insecure or hurt that we need to grab things.
A scarcity mindset.
Scarcity, exactly. Emotional scarcity or actual scarcity, right? You know, another piece that I constantly come back to, just in my own thinking about my own life and, you know, life in community, is the idea that because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, we are commanded to love the stranger. And, you know, in the language of the book of Shemot, Exodus, atem yedatem et nefesh hager, you know what it feels like to be vulnerable. And this idea that in the DNA of what it means to be a Jew, to inherit the Torah, is to be committed to empathy. And what are the ways in which I shut myself off to empathy? It's hard. I'm busy. Actually, I'm afraid that if I'm empathetic, it'll kill me because there's so much suffering around me. That's one of the ways in which I feel vulnerable. Don't ask me for empathy. It's too much to ask. You know, so those are two places which are not obvious. They're not explicitly about teshuva at all. And in a funny way, although I wasn't intending it that way, they're very much related, right? One is about what blocks the flow of generosity, and the other is what blocks the kind of empathy that allows me to see someone who's vulnerable. Or, you know, if I could develop that second idea in just one more sentence, it can be so tempting to take my own suffering as an excuse to blind myself to other people's suffering. Or worse, to justify my inflicting it on other people. And instead to say, the Torah is asking me, learn love from your own suffering. That's like hard stuff.
Yeah.
That's deep, deep work. You know, on a personal level. And Musar, in a very interesting way, personalizes that, I think. It doesn't just say, oh, the Jewish people are obligated to learn. It's like, no, you, Justin, are obligated, right? If I remember correctly, Rav Elia Lopian, one of the great Musar teachers of the 20th century, he says at one point, atem yedatem et nefesh hager, you know the feelings of the stranger, is not a mere description, it's also a prescription. You have to know your own, this is the therapy piece again, right? You have to know your own pain, which leads you to hurt other people, or at least to turn a blind eye to their suffering. You have to know those parts. You have to know what you yourself have been through. And that's, as we know, that's really deep work.
So I have a few questions that come out of that, but I want to be sensitive to our time. One is, I'll just ask it directly, which is, you know, post-October 7th, and thinking about the national pain there, and then bringing our lens to teshuva, right? There was, you know, around Tisha B'Av, there was all the questions of the 9th of Av questions about October 7th. What is the October, why is Elul, why is teshuva different this year post-October 7th? Or how is it different?
Yeah, this is such a hard question, which of course, the answers you'll get to this question will depend on people's political perspectives in very deep ways. I think that one way that I might answer this, I think I would answer this in a lot of different ways, and to be quite honest, in different ways, different times of the day, because I'm still very much in that phase with all this. But I think...
And Elul's just starting,
Exactly. But I think one of the challenges we face is that even if and when we decide that strong and even military responses are necessary, we are never permitted to allow our empathy to totally be dulled. I just don't, if you want to see it in a purely internal way, because of what it does to us. And if you want to see it in a more obviously interpersonal relational way, because otherwise we license ourselves to behave in really terrible ways. I think, related to this is a discussion that I have in this book about and in ways that are deeply influenced by Rav Yitz, more so than is explicit, although it's explicit also. If we really think that one of the core teachings of the Jewish tradition is the infinite value of every human being, we can never permit ourselves the temptation to dehumanize other people, no matter how tempted we are. And part of the reason for that is that when you dehumanize other people, you end up giving yourself a moral blank check whether you intend to or not. And that's just, I think, very dangerous ground to walk on. By the way, it's also a great paradox that when you dehumanize people in a funny way, you absolve them of their moral responsibility, right? If you say about someone, I would never say about, I see this a lot in certain parts of Israeli discourse, that the people who did what they did are, in Israeli phrase, chayot adam. They're animal people. And I think what they did is, it goes without saying, I hope, almost unfathomably unspeakable in its horror. They're not animals. And to say that they are is on some level to let them off the hook. They are human beings like you and me, and yet they behaved as they did. And that's part of the sort of accountability. So it's a double edge. You don't want to dehumanize people because you want everyone, I think, to be accountable. And you don't want to dehumanize people because then you treat them as subhuman. It's almost like in a biblical way, this is something I think that in the tradition struggled with this. If you talk about Amalek, the Amalekites, in too dramatic a way, you license yourself to do things that sound like what the Amalekites did. That's why I think, Jewish thinkers have always struggled. What do you mean wipe out Amalek's great-grandchildren? What? Right? Murder their kids? Wait a minute, right? And so how do you find a way to sort of acknowledge evil when it's been done, to stare it in the face, and yet not to let your own humanity to be extinguished in the process? I mean, I think that's also
impossible. It's
very hard work.
Right. I remember I was once teaching Rabbi Yitz's Torah, I think in Boston, with Mark Baker's group there, and I taught Rabbi Yitz's Torah of infinitely valuable, equal, and unique, and someone said, this was way before October 7th, like, what if that person's coming out a gun with you, right? If that person's trying to hurt you, that person's playing a different sport than you, they don't see you as infinitely valuable, equal, and unique. How do you keep that mindset on while still?
Well, I think maybe another way of asking this question is, can you sometimes fight someone without dehumanizing them? Right. I would like to think that you can. Right. I'm open to being challenged and critiqued on this point. In fact, I think for me, theologically, it would be very hard to live with a world in which you can't. Right.
Which, again, I'll acknowledge is easy for us to say at a table in New York. I think certainly when you're on the battlefield, the mindset it can't be, if you are soft for 1 second, you could kill your entire
100%,
unit.
right.
So it's very hard.
I remember once reading an essay. I don't remember honestly anything about what she said, but I remember being very taken with the title so much that I stopped and read the essay by a Christian philosopher. The title of the essay was something like, "Can soldiers on the battlefield love their enemies?"
Right, right.
Great Christian question, right? And that's exactly right. I mean, it's easy for me to say.
Right.
And I'm not, honestly, I don't mean this as an evasion. I would direct my own critique to some of, at the moment at least, to some of Jewish public discourse rather than to the question of military ethics.
Thank you for clarifying.
I mean, military ethics is its own incredibly difficult set of questions. I think I'm talking about more what I've heard.
How we talk about it.
Yeah. Great. Many Jewish thinkers I respect and admire use language that I personally find, what can I say? I understand the temptation, and I still think you got to do a better job of resisting it.
I hear that. All right, my final question, we have like a minute, is as follows. You've been someone who's been public about pain and personal struggle, and I know you've gone through that for a while, and you're also a theologian. I know there's lots of people that are going through similar experiences like that out there. To what extent does theology come into you navigating the pain that you have gone through in your life, and if so, how?
Yeah, that's a whole net of really, I think, interesting questions. I've really actually been thinking about this again lately, and I'll try to share how without being excessively exhibitionistic. You know, one way in which theology comes into it for me is in the challenge we were just talking about how can you let your suffering teach you love? Mm-hmm. And the ways in which I've tried to learn. I think that all in all, my illness and pain have made me a better pastor, but it took me a long time to realize that I was guilty of something that was like really problematic, both for my own life and for my relationship with other people, which was I was so committed to this idea that our suffering should teach us love, that I was not honest with myself about the way my suffering had also taught me anger and frustration. Mm-hmm. And I actually think in order to really grow in love, you also have to acknowledge the ways that your experiences stimulate very different responses. Mm-hmm. I don't think I was honest with myself about that for a long time. And I think one of the ways in which I've grown in the last few years is realizing, yeah, it's not like some Pollyannish thing where incredible physical suffering has made me kinder. Mm-hmm. Incredible physical suffering has amplified a lot of things in me. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying all the time to nurture this one thing that it's amplified in me, but not that there's some automatic anything to that. And that's been like a real growth experience. I think that when I look back on the ways that I think I've grown from illness, I begin to wonder whether God has been more present with me than I have realized in the worst moments. Let me put it that way, right? Meaning, there are moments when anyone who's ever experienced, I think, chronic debilitating illness, I think probably has some sense of this, when you feel like I'm totally alone and trapped in this, right? And there's no, even the people who love me cannot find their way into the subjective experience of what illness is. And I've had moments for me which have been, religiously torment in that way, because I feel, to sound like the book of Psalms for a minute, where is God right now? Mm-hmm. Never needed God so badly as I do now. And then I think just lately I've had a few moments, certainly not all the time, where I think, oh, maybe God was there precisely in my coming to learn a little bit more about being present with other people's pain. Maybe that wasn't just a command that I was responding to, but an inspiration that was with me in some way. Wow. But that's momentary, right? I don't pretend to be some, fully realized,
yeah, of course.
I've realized. But I have had just recently these flashes that have been very, very moving, I have to say, like restorative of faith in some way.
Beautiful. Shai, thank you so much. On a spiritual level, may we all return, and of course, on a physical level, may the hostages return, and may we all be in the places that we need to be, and everyone should be healthy, and you should be healthy, and may God, or whatever you put in for the word God, guide us on our journey of Teshuva this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.